Hello, you're watching Rappler, and we are in Parañaque City in Metro Manila, where the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Foreign Ministers meetings and the post-ministerial conferences just concluded. Bukas actually, may isa pang event yung ASEAN with Manila as chairperson for this week. Yun yung anniversary ng Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. But all of that just really means na for the past 5, 6 days, top officials, top diplomats from all over the world, foreign ministers, have been converging here in Manila to meet, engage with their with ASEAN as a bloc, their ASEAN counterparts, but also foreign ministers from ASEAN's dialogue partners, both old and emerging. I am Cupin. I am joined by my colleague Lance. You have been covering the many different meetings, conferences, reaffirmations and reassurances by the foreign ministers here in Manila. So ano bang pinag-usapan ng mga foreign minister dito sa Manila? Well, yung overarching theme, I would say, of these meetings, not just this week but really the chairmanship of the Philippines, especially after the U.S. and Israel's war on Iran, has really been helping ASEAN figure out how it can navigate, in so many words, a turbulent world. No? Iba-iba yung iteration, turbulent, unstable, shifts, shocks, kung ano-anong adjectives or adverbs na nagamit so far ng ating diplomats and foreign officials. So, really, this was also repeated by Philippine Foreign Secretary and the chairperson of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, si Secretary Maria Teresa Lazaro kanina. Ang binanggit niya, global challenges. So just to give you an idea of the meetings that have happened the past 3 days, of course, on Tuesday, we started with the AMM, or yung ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting, and then may plenary yun, may retreat. And then the day after, all of the plus ones happened. So ASEAN plus whoever that dialogue partner is, US, China, Russia, South Korea, India, the list is quite long. And then today you had the bigger meeting. So merong ASEAN plus 3, that would be China, Japan, and South Korea. Meron ding ASEAN, or rather Asia Regional Forum, and then you have the East Asia Summit. So those are rather bigger, bigger meetings. Again, obviously featuring the foreign minister, at least their deputies, kung yung iba kasi umalis na kaagad. But all of these things, all of these meetings are really in preparation for a much bigger meeting that Manila is preparing to host in November 2026, yun yung ASEAN Summit, where we expect to see world leaders, heads of governments, heads of state, some royalty, although may royalty rin actually na pumunta dito kasi yung foreign minister ng Brunei is also their prince. But anyway, so all of these things to discuss yung pressing issues in affecting the region, but really the world too. So before I pass it on to my colleague Lance, siguro what are these global issues that we're talking about? Well, yung top of mind talaga na pinag-uusapan ngayon ng mga foreign ministers, yung situation sa Middle East. Lance will talk about this a little more, but the past few days, past few weeks, things have turned more unstable. Yung shaky truce between Iran and the US has faltered, which means hindi na nakakadaan as best as it could a few weeks ago yung mga vessels that carry precious oil and energy, of which Asia and Southeast Asia is very heavily dependent on. And to add to that, yung conflicts din or tensions within the region as well. So one top of mind, of course, is the Myanmar situation. Lazaro also happens to be the chair's special envoy to Myanmar. She's heading there actually by third quarter of this year, fourth quarter of this year, before 2026 ends, for a humanitarian mission, in her own words. Marami pa siyang goals, yung 5-point consensus na review, pinag-usapan din ng foreign ministers. The energy that Secretary Lazaro was giving off earlier was that malayo pa yung compliance ng Myanmar as a 5-point consensus or the peace plan of ASEAN for Myanmar post-junta, which means therefore it's very unlikely that we'll see junta leaders engaging directly with Myanmar, with ASEAN rather, just yet. And then of course the Cambodia-Thailand border crisis, although that has been put aside, or at least managed so far by a truce between the two countries. And of course yung South China Sea issue, that is quite a gut issue in the Philippine context, because just a few days ago, nagkaroon ng confrontation sa Ayungin Shoal. And just this morning, ginamitan ulit ng China Coast Guard ng water cannon at ng dangerous maneuvers yung B4 vessels ng Philippines. So all of those issues being tackled here. Of course, ASEAN, because it builds on consensus and cooperation. What foreign ministers want to focus on is yung how we can move forward, how we can work together, but you can't ignore yung differences of not just all of the nations, but within ASEAN itself. But again, like I was mentioning earlier, my colleague here, Lance, will be talking a little more about the Middle East. Kasi yun talaga, no? Kasi in the discussions of ASEAN, especially even with the foreign ministers, we always talk about security, strategic security. So when you say strategic security, usually you think about defense, but that's not really the case. If you say strategic security, you want your country, you want your bloc to be secure from economic shocks, which you can talk to us about.
Yeah, actually, I agree. So even if, let's say, economics wasn't the primary focus here, no, parang in a way, economics is pretty much inescapable, right? You can't really isolate it from politics. What affects economics is also very political. And I think that was something that Secretary Lazaro was highlighting quite a bit. She mentioned that the Strait of Hormuz, it was a dominant issue for all of us. That was her words. And I think to give a bit of an illustration why, the Strait of Hormuz, it's a passageway, very narrow, where most of the oil that Asia in particular uses. So especially when we talk about the Philippines, for example, we are extremely oil dependent. We don't really produce a significant amount of oil for us to consume. And most of it comes from the Middle East. So that's why when we're talking about tensions in the Middle East, tensions around the Strait of Hormuz, that really affects us, and that also affects our Southeast Asian neighbors. So not just energy in particular, actually. Fertilizer is also one of the things that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. I think that's often forgotten. But that also feeds into, for example, food security. So these are things that have been shaping ASEAN's conversations when we talk about it in the broader context. They also have, for example, I think this was mentioned a while ago, the ASEAN Petroleum Security Agreement. So I think the best way to see this is it's still a bit of an aspiration. So they have it, they have talks around it. And in general, what they plan to do is to have a framework for them to agree on, agree on how to share petroleum during times of crisis like this.
And it's tricky in ASEAN because we have different, to say the least, levels of energy security as a specific country, right?
Yeah, and like you mentioned, not everyone has the same needs, but of course, this is something that's the whole goal of ASEAN, right? To be cooperative. And I think another thing that they want is also still very much in the works. This is the ASEAN Power Grid. And the goal, once this is done, this is a very long-term solution, but once it's done, is for them to be able to essentially trade power. So let's say you need power in one country, you can move it from one country to another. But as you can imagine, this would take a while. The Philippines, for example, we haven't even connected the Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao grid. So what more connecting it
to
across ASEAN? So those are some of the broad economic points raised by ASEAN. But maybe going a bit deeper into some of the major powers among the dialogue partners that you mentioned. I think what stands out, of course, is the United States. Rubio visited Marcos, and they had some talks. And what Rubio seems to be positioning here is that the U.S., aside from being, for example, a strategic defense partner, they're also an investor. So that brings us to Pax Silica, of course. Now, Pax Silica, for those who might not be aware of it yet, is a way for the U.S. to attract investments to the Luzon Economic Corridor, specifically focusing on AI and advanced technologies. So that could be data centers, that can be manufacturing mga chips, and that the way to describe it is it's upgrading the Philippines' position from just being raw materials to actually involved in the production and even having data centers there. But there's a lot of questions surrounding that, of course, when it comes to data, when it comes to electricity, when it comes to water. So that's something that is still very much developing. China was also here, but like you mentioned, most of the discussions with China really revolved around the West Philippine Sea. And I think that in itself is a bit of a statement, because now I think what we want to think about is whether these tensions, for example, would lead us to having slower economic ties with China, whether we'll see less deals, less investments from China. Of course, we know from the previous administration they were very friendly with China, and that created a different economic environment for them. So I think that's something to monitor. And of course, Russia was also here.
Right.
Now, Russia is a bit interesting because Russia is positioning itself as an alternative partner when it comes to energy, because of course, Russia has a lot of oil, and given that the Middle East route is major stressed, so Russia is coming in and saying that they can be a partner to ASEAN countries. But I think one of the points to remember when trading with Russia is that it can be a bit complicated because, for example, bank transactions and things like this there are a bit of restrictions when it comes to trading with Russia in that sense.
Right.
So maybe given all of that, all this economic talk, you can bring us back also to what the discussions have been in other terms.
Yeah, I think yung kunento ni Lance, no, parang it also, it's a snapshot of just how complicated the world is. And that sounds like a very silly generalized statement to make, but I'm just saying, di ba? Lazaro made it a point earlier, I think, to emphasize na convergence point yung Philippines. You had all of these top world leaders coming to Manila again, like you mentioned, di ba? Wang Yi returned to Manila for the first time since 2022. That was the early months of the Marcos administration, long before talagang lumaki yung tensions ng Philippines at China over maritime disputes in the South China Sea, or rather China's incursions in the West Philippine Sea. Marco Rubio visited the Philippines for the first time as State Secretary. He's been here before as a senator rather, but of course it's a very different context. In fact, ang haba ng stay niya dito. He was here from the 21st up until today, the 23rd. So that's quite a long time for a foreign minister to visit here. It was a flurry of bilateral meetings, really. Just to give you a quick summary, like Rubio's meetings here included, of course, a meeting with Lazaro. He also met with Wang Yi. He also met with Russia's foreign minister. He also convened a Quad meeting. Yung Quad, yung quadrilateral arrangement between the US, Japan, Australia, and India. Ostensibly, dahil sa COVID, as a response to the COVID pandemic, but it's since evolved into a bigger kind of minilateral. Parang it's extended into security even. And this is something actually that China is quite weary about. So you have all these, siguro for some people, ironies. Now you have Manila, who has tensions with China, maritime-wise, right? Being the venue for, let's say, a Rubio or a Wang to meet. Rubio and the Russian foreign minister to meet. Parang there was a release by the State Department saying na both Rubio and his Russian counterpart agreed that the Russia-Ukraine war should end, but to whose terms? Hindi tayo sure kung ano yung exact wording ng mga meetings. And also to give you a context, no? To give you added context pala. All these bilateral meetings all happened, almost all of them practically happened in the PICC. That's also where all the conferences and meetings under the ASEAN umbrella happen. So yung building ng or yung complex rather ng PICC, doon nangyayari lahat ng high-level discussions. Many of them, most of them frankly, we're not really privy to the details of. Kasi if you were bored enough to watch the broadcast of the ASEAN meetings, you would notice na opening statement lang yung ine-ere. After that, everything is closed door. It's up to a country if they want to release the intervention or the speeches of their foreign minister. Eventually, the same will happen during the November summit. We also don't know what exactly was talked about in bilateral meetings. Usually, at best, they'll allow the media to cover the opening statements, but we don't know for sure. We only know the results of the meetings through readouts by each side, and of course, each side will only announce points that favors them for the most part. Like for example, yung meeting ni Lazaro at ni Wang Yi, ang release ng DFA ng Philippines was that Lazaro brought up a list of grievances of the Philippines and protests of the Philippines. Topmost, of course, yung Ayungin incident, yung racist Monkey China Daily video. She also brought up the structures in Scarborough Shoal, and in general, yung actions ng China daw that trample on the rights of Filipino personnel and Filipino fisherfolk. that was not mentioned in the China press release or the readout, right? The Chinese side, meanwhile, the MOFA, the MFA of China, just said that Wang Yi protested what they view as Philippine aggressive action in Ayungin Shoal. So again, all of this to say, no, parang it from perhaps someone who doesn't follow foreign affairs or diplomacy closely, it might be dizzying to see. And there are even contradictions. Kasi you have the ASEAN foreign ministers calling on the rule of law, calling on diplomacy over kinetic action or war, if you want to call it that. But then you have them dialoguing with Russia, dialoguing with the US. So again, siguro if it's not yet obvious, like it's a difficult time for leaders, not just countries like the Philippines, not just a bloc like ASEAN, but it's really a difficult time to navigate all these contradictions and all these overlapping and divergent interests by different countries, not just from Southeast Asia, but the rest of the world. So, yung concluding documents dito, may statement yung ASEAN expressing concern over the Middle East, or the situation in the Middle East. Was pointed out earlier that Iran's deputy minister said ASEAN should be stronger in its statements on the Middle East. After all, ASEAN stands for the rule of law and rules that govern the world order, and yet from their perspective, from Iran's perspective, parang hina naman daw ng statement ng ASEAN. And speaking of pagkahina or lack of forcefulness in statements, the other day when Lazaro was asked if the Ayungin incident was discussed among foreign ministers in the bloc, sabi niya she did bring it up and there was no response. So, ASEAN is always criticized as being talk shop lang, yes and no, right? Because you have all these discussions, all these outcome documents, and for the average Filipino, for the average Southeast Asian, perhaps it might be difficult to see kung ano ba talaga yung material effects of these outcome documents.
But in a way, that's also how ASEAN operates, right? By consensus.
Yeah.
That's the only way it survived.
Yeah. She was saying Lazaro was asked about the Myanmar situation, na parang in so many ways, parang iba-iba yung tanong, di ba? Parang isang tanong, will Myanmar still be part of ASEAN? Are they doing enough? What's your assessment so far? And she said something like, ASEAN is patient. Now, see, that patience is both its boon and bane. ASEAN's slowness has been, you would argue, a source of stability for the region and its partners, but also a point of criticism. Kasi nga parang in the context of Myanmar, for instance, ang sinasabi ng mga critics, ang dami nang namamatay, ang daming nahihirapan, humanitarian crisis nga, right? Within its own borders, but ASEAN is very slow to respond or not forceful enough in its response, and even in the South China Sea. Probably felt mostly by Filipinos who see these videos and hear these reports of harassment in the South China Sea, and then you read a statement expressing strong concern over the situation in waters that a lot of ASEAN nations share. So, in more informal parlance, ASEAN not beating the talk shop allegations. But I think what's important to see here, again, in its slowness, that also means ASEAN ideally looks forward. Yung perspective is much longer, which also means you have to have more patience in actually hoping your leaders carry through with their promise. Like Lance mentioned, very ambitious goals, frankly, from Cebu, right? If you rattle off the list of their aspirations, yung power grid, yung basically a framework in which to share energy, very high aspirations. Clearly, that would only be good news if implemented properly. But the question is, how do you implement it properly? Things like that. So, I mean, South China Sea pa lang, the hope, hindi na explain na actually ni Secretary Lazaro kung bakit hopeful pa rin tayo na by the end of 2026 matatapos na yung COC or Code of Conduct na yan. But she did say, again, repeating the usual ASEAN talking points, every month nagmi-meet, there is a commitment from China and ASEAN to conclude the talks. But we'll see what happens, frankly, by November. More or less, yun na siguro yung deadline talaga ng Philippines. Technically, until December. But in November, again, you will have all 10, including President Marcos, all 10 ASEAN leaders. Myanmar will only be represented by their permanent secretary. All 10 ASEAN leaders, we expect leaders of its dialogue partners to come to the Philippines, to come to Manila in November for the highest level, the highest kind of meetings within the ASEAN framework. So, again, bukas actually may isa pang event, but that will be the commemoration of the TAC. We'll see more countries acceding to the TAC or reaffirming, like I said, favorite word ng ASEAN, reaffirming their commitment to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. That is actually a promise na you choose diplomacy over conflict or fighting, kinetic action. No? You always choose diplomacy, and maybe that's what ASEAN hopes for in its slowness and its patience. Lance, anything to add?
I think, well, as you mentioned, this slowness and heel dragging, it's frustrating, but in a way, that's how these things work, right?
So, again, we will see in November, kasi yung idea nga nito is this prepares the bloc for the leaders to meet in November. Those decisions, yun yung magiging binding talaga sa ASEAN. I think it would be unthinkable to expect like a proper APSA framework or more concrete plans for APSA or that shared power grid. But we will look forward, or at least I and Lance will look forward to the outcomes in November from this meeting leading up to November. But so far, that's it from us here in Metro Manila. Finally, a long week of high-level talks hosted by the Philippines, hosting different foreign ministers from all over the world. Again, my name is Cupin.
That's you.
You have been watching Rappler.